What if I told you there was once a king so physically uncanny that his own people whispered he was hexed by the devil, and yet the truth was darker than demons because the curse was not cast by sorcery, but bred by 1,000 careful marriages? If you dare to open the sealed doors of his palace and look upon what power did to flesh and mind, hit subscribe now, because this is where legend ends and the autopsy of an empire begins. Meet Charles II of Spain, El Hechizado the Bewitched, a monarch raised in rooms heavy with incense and fear, whose every portrait looked like a painter's apology, a sovereign whose crown seemed lighter than the weight of his own bloodline. For generations, the Habsburgs had treated Europe like a chessboard, and their family tree like a braid pulled ever tighter, insisting that purity preserved power, not knowing that the rope they were weaving would one day find its loop around a child king's life. Born into gold-roofed palaces and winter-cold corridors, Charles was christened with oceans of candles and the prayers of a continent. And yet from his first breaths the court watched for omens, stumbling steps, troubled sleep fevers that came like debts collecting at midnight. Physicians gathered like astronomers charting the eclipses of his health with potions and poultices, while priests came with relics and whispered the old names of angels, each faction certain that the other misunderstood the nature of the darkness settled in the boy. The palace learned to move to his rhythms, tutors trimming lessons to the length of his breath, musicians softening fanfares to spare his nerves, servants mastered in the art of making tragedy look ceremonial, and weakness look like mystery. Outside, an empire held its breath because Spain's dominions were a quilt stretched from Flanders to the Indies, and when the hand that must hold it all together trembles, borders begin to whisper the language of knives. Courtiers invented euphemisms, the way poets invent metaphors, delicate health, melancholic humors, excessive devotion, phrases that kept the truth politely dressed, while ambassadors wrote longer letters home, and kings across Europe measured their advantage with the patience of wolves. His mother, Mariana of Austria, ruled as regent, with the grim piety of a nun, guarding a furnace surrounding the boy with confessors and confessors' spies, believing that if sin could be starved from the air, then perhaps illness would starve too. Yet rumors multiplied faster than prayers that witches had charmed the cradle, that an enemy's hex had sealed the royal line, that a woman with a dead child placed the tiny garment beneath his sheets, and in the middle of all this, a truth more terrifying waited, inked not by sorcerers but by genealogists and one day by surgeons' hands. The boy's day was measured in rituals, a silver spoon lifted to reluctant lips, a tutor's lesson reduced to names and dates that evaporated like breath on glass, a physician's fingers counting the flutter in his wrist, and everywhere the choreography of concealment tapestries pulled to darken windows, servants trained to move like shadows so that weakness could pass for mystique. Mariana of Austria. His mother and regent surrounded him with confessors and counselors until piety became a palisade. Foremost among them was a steel-eyed Jesuit whose diagnoses mixed sin with humors, and as petitions piled at the Escorial, the nickname crept into the corridors, El Hechizado the Bewitched, because it was easier to blame a hex than a dynasty. But Spain's patience frayed where power pooled, and into Madrid rode Don John of Austria the Younger, the king's charismatic half-brother greeted by cheers, thin with hunger. He promised to tear away the veils of sorcery and incompetence alike, and for the first time, the palace realized that the quieter the throne became, the louder the city would speak. Physicians bickered like philosophers in a furnace, some prescribed coral dust and ground pearls to fortify spirits, others leached blood to balance black bile, and one swore that a tincture of mercury would burn away whatever night gnawed at the king, while astrologers mapped the heavens for favorable hours and swore that Saturn had taken up residence in his bones. An exorcist arrived with the Rituale Romanum, and the court, hungry for a spectacle that might also be a cure, watched candles gutter and incense thicken, as Latin syllables marched like soldiers across the room. The king's lips trembled, his eyes fixed on a crucifix, and when the rites ended, nothing had left his body except hope carefully bottled and labeled next time. Beyond the velvet, Spain's sinews, thinned silver fleets staggered in late, and light fields drank too much rain or too little, and along the Pyrenean frontier the Sun King tested borders as if pressing a bruise. A great empire is not felled by a single blow, but by many small agreed-upon surrenders, and every courier who arrived breathless added another. When Charles was proclaimed of age, bells rang, as if sound could carry strength across arteries, and on the balcony he tried to raise a hand steady enough to be read as promise. It shook, then steadied, and for a heartbeat the crowd saw not a monster, but a man struggling against the script written into his marrow. A solution wrapped itself in silk and ceremony. Marie-Louise of Orléans, niece to the French king, arrived in a whisper of perfume and diplomatic calculation. She laughed like glass-catching sun taught the court to ride at dusk and taste apricots with sugar, and the nation exhaled because where there is a bride, there might be an heir. But a cradle did not fill, and the palace, inventive in its cruelties, turned to remedies that tasted of stables and monasteries, bull's blood and bitter herbs, pilgrimages, and relics pressed to skin, talismans sewn into linen, and midnight draughts that left him pallid by morning. Every failure was explained with a new superstition, every humiliation wrapped in the ribbon of duty. Whispers hardened into accusations. Someone had knotted the royal seed, someone had brewed a binding draft. Someone's prayer was really a curse, and committees met in quiet rooms to weigh testimonies that sounded like dreams. A second marriage was proposed, as if a new bride could overwrite a bloodline, and somewhere a surgeon sharpened his instruments for when politics fails, the body is the next archive to be opened. The witch hunt began not in cellars but in salons where enemies were named between sips of chocolate, and plans were drafted in the margins of court masks. The Austrian party whispered that sorcery clung to the king like smoke from a bad candle. The Castilian grandees hissed that Mariana's favorites had woven the knot, and Don John of Austria the Younger rode through Madrid like a cleansing fire, banishing one minister, humiliating another, promising to tear up the spell by the roots, even if the roots were sown under the palace floor. Don John found a kingdom held together by ceremonies and debts, a treasury that echoed like an empty reliquary, and a bureaucracy that could process a miracle faster than a shipment of grain. He bullied courtiers into plain speech, stared down confessors, planned the mending of armies, then fell suddenly ill and died. And Madrid decided, because Madrid always decides, that such a death was either punishment from heaven or a cup soured by enemies. And either way, the old veils floated back across the corridors, as if the brief draft of reform had never blown. Marie-Louise tried to make the palace breathe like a living house again, ordering gardens replanted with citrus and laughter, coaxing Charles to ride, teaching him a French card game that made him smile in a way that frightened his tutors because it looked like hope. While across the Pyrenees, the Sun King studied that smile the way a general studies a map, calculating how many seasons of pressure it could survive. Then, one winter, the queen's stomach seized like a fist and would not unclench, and the palace expert in tragedy rehearsed its steps with cold efficiency. Doctors, bled priests, prayed rival factions, floated their favorite poisons on silver trays of rumor. And when Marie-Louise died, the bells told Madrid what it already knew, that every lullaby in this story was only an intermission between autopsies, whether of bodies or of policies. Europe supplied candidates like apothecaries supply vials, and the choice Maria Anna of Neuburg came advertised with a pedigree of fertility so dazzling it felt like theology, her sisters strewing nursery rooms across the German states like pearls. The wedding was all velvet and incense and foreign smiles, And that night the city knelt to count seconds as if the future might be measured like rainfall. But morning brought only polite reports and an unchanged, echoing cradle. Outside the palace, Madrid crackled with brittle hunger grain. Too dear, taxes too many, the silver fleets thin as rumors, and processions wound through streets carrying saints' bones and candle smoke, while in the council chambers men who had never missed a meal voted to miss several on behalf of others. When borders juddered under French pressure, it sounded in the capital like a cupboard slamming shut on an empty shelf. Physicians, increasingly desperate, built cures from theater-powdered staghorn for vigor-damp sheets and cold baths for fevers of the mind. Spanish fly for a spark that would not catch pilgrimages stitched into itineraries as if faith were a poultice. Charles endured it all with a gentleness that made servants weep in kitchens, his jaw-heavy speech thick on bad days, eyes luminous on good ones, and each failure ended the same way with another whisper about knots tied by unseen hands. Maria Anna proved less a bride than a minister in silk, building a small court within the court trading favors for loyalties, letting Austrian envoys pour confidence into her ear and then ladle it back out at table. She learned how to place a document before the king so that signing became a gesture of piety rather than policy, and the more childless the marriage remained, the more fertile the intrigues grew. Foreign embassies turned into weather stations, charting the barometer of Spanish succession in the curve of the king's signature and the tremor of his hand. In London and Versailles, maps were quietly redrawn on green bays under polite euphemisms. Compensation guarantees equilibrium. Each line a future war rehearsing its first step, and within the Escorial a simpler line gathered its own gravity, the line at the bottom of a will. As illness layered itself upon fatigue, Charles clasped harder to the bone white rails of faith, visiting the shrine of the Virgin of Atocha, kissing reliquaries until his lips tasted of metal, and welcoming holy men who promised that what politics could not mend, piety might mend, so that at last exorcists were summoned again with notebooks and files to measure the devil's footprint, and one of them eyes alight with certainty, whispered of things he claimed to have drawn from the king's throat, things that would make even a rational age feel the cold breath of a medieval chapel on its neck. The exorcist's journal read like a theater program for terror vigils at midnight. Relics pressed to a fevered brow, litanies rising and falling like oars on black water. And at the crescendo he claimed to draw from the king's mouth invisible knots and tokens that no one else could quite see, only believe. And for a few trembling days the palace moved as if unburdened, until the old heaviness returned like damp under paint. A pamphlet were erupted beyond the gates, physicians ridiculing demons with the bravado of men who had no better cure, preachers ridiculing physicians with the certainty of men who had never lanced a vein. Madrid, read by candlelight and argued by sunrise while in the royal bedroom, the patient truth remained unchanged. A crown set gently on a head that ached. Into that ache poured the voices of Europe-Austrian envoys, whispering that only a Habsburg could keep the realm unbroken. French envoys promising that a Bourbon nephew would bring peace and plenty, and every argument dressed itself as love for Spain, even as fingers traced borders on velvet maps, as if they were already their own. The streets sang their own litany, bread, dear taxes, endless soldiers sullen and thin processions winding past shuttered shops with saints' bones like pale flags. Thunder rolled over the Guadarrama, and people said it was God scolding ministers, but the wiser sighed that storms seldom audit ledgers. Medicine returned with new costumes, antimony cups to purify the blood, Peruvian bark to cool fevers that had no temperature. Bezoar stones hung on cords like talismans with invoices. The king submitted with a courtesy that shamed his doctors, thanking each for hope even as hope kept arriving, dressed as disappointment. Nights lengthened. Servants found him in the gallery of ancestors, staring at faces that shared his jaw, and his sorrow the painted Habsburgs looking down like judges at a trial, where the verdict had been decided before the jury was born. He whispered names, as if unspelling a spell, and the names only echoed back within the gilded frame. A retreat to a monastery promised quiet and counsel. There, a gray monk whose wisdom smelled of parchment and rain told him that Spain was not a dowry to be packed into a marriage, but a trust to be signed for the sake of souls not yet born. And Charles listened as if the words were a rope thrown across a flooded river. Back in Madrid, Maria Anna stitched alliances with the patience of a lace-maker, twining favors through fingers until gentlemen called obligations friendship. Messengers came and went at odd hours, letters nested in iron chests, and the wax on her seal darkened from crimson to almost black as if even color could learn intrigue. Drafts of a will multiplied like reflections in a mirror, each slightly different, each fiercely argued in rooms where curtains muffled the world. To choose the Austrian was to invite a French war, to choose the Bourbon was to invite an Austrian one. And the only certainty was that Spain's skin would be where Europe tested its knives. At last, the pen scratched the final name, and the seal sank into wax with a soft, irreversible kiss, and although the paper cooled quickly, the hand that signed it did not. His breath shorter, his legs heavier with water, a body declaring bankruptcy in the quiet language of organs, and somewhere already a surgeon was setting aside a clean sheet for an autopsy that would turn rumor into scripture. Dawn crawled into the royal chamber like a tired penitent, and found the king sitting upright, eyes bruised with sleeplessness, hands cupped as if to catch something falling from an invisible height, and those who attended him felt a hush settle that no litany could lift the sense that a rain had reached the part of the map where cartographers draw sea serpents and write beyond this only water. Couriers hammered the roads like iron beetles. Versailles and Vienna, reading each dispatch as if it were a change in the weather. And every court tailored its hope with scissors of calculation, some measuring the distance from Madrid to Paris in triumph, others measuring from Madrid to the Danube in dread, while in the sick room the geometry was simpler. A bedside, a chair, a crucifix, and a breath that shortened as if rehearsing absence. Charles asked for the relics again, kissed the glass that caged the splinter of a saint, and thanked his confessor with a courtesy that made the old priest weep, because courtesy is a strange music when played in a room where time has begun to fold its scores, and outside the window a late leaf loosened and did not fall as if even gravity felt it must wait for the final amen. On a holy day, bright with bells that sounded like silver poured from a height, he labored to sign the cross and whispered a child's prayer he had never quite forgotten, then turned his head toward the light, as if listening to footfalls in a corridor he alone could see. When the light moved, he did not, and the city learned again how quickly a throne becomes a chair. The physicians, dutiful as scribes, opened the last archive a king carries, and wrote a report whose ink smelled of shock and certainty, claiming a withered heart. Blackened organs water where vigor should have been a body that read like a commentary on a family tree, all of it presented as science, yet arranged like a medieval sermon, so that even skeptics felt a draft from some ancient chapel slide under the door. In council chambers, the seal on the will broke like dawn through cloud, and letters flapped toward Europe with a single name bright as a war trumpet. Philip of Anjou-Bourbon, nephew and grandson to the Sun King, while the Habsburg envoys swallowed their rage like hot wine, and the wax of what could not be unsaid hardened into history. Streets learned new slogans faster than they learned prices, and in taverns men traced on damp tables the alliances that would soon carve fields and cities, because maps are only promises until boots confirm them. Drums answered pens, and the War of the Spanish Succession shouldered its way from parchment into harvests, carrying with it years that would spend themselves in smoke and drumbeat. Yet for all the treaties and cavalry, the quieter verdict belonged to a portrait gallery, where faces with the same jawline looked down from oils that never tire, and anyone who cared to count could trace how power, when fed its own reflection for centuries, develops a taste for itself so strong it forgets every other food, until a dynasty mistakes survival for purity and purity for a prayer that God never taught. Pamphleteers turned the autopsy into metaphor, priests into warning, philosophers into lecture, and mothers into a soft practical grief, because empires change hands with pageantry, but widows and bakers and carpenters learn first what it means when a border moves. They count in bread, in sons not coming home, and candles burned to stubs before a wooden saint whose eyes, like all painted eyes, never close. And somewhere in the Escorial, a monk copied a line that might have been the only true epitaph. He tried to be a king with a body that had been asked to be a dynasty, while couriers galloped and cannons rehearsed, and Europe leaned toward a decade of iron. Yet, our story is not finished, because what the war did to Spain and what Spain's lesson did to Europe belongs to the living, not the dead. The war that followed moved like weather across a continent, fronts boiling up out of clear mornings and collapsing by dusk, and the names that schoolboys would later memorize, dukes and marshals and princes, were at the time only riders carrying dust, while villages learned to tell armies by the sound of their forges and the smell of their horses before uniforms came into view. In council tents lit by guttering candles, maps lay flat as if they could tame the hills they pictured, and fingers traced rivers toward cities whose gates would decide a season. The trumpet's glittering arithmetic met the mud's stubborn logic, and somewhere a courier galloped with news that a victory had cost too much to be called anything but a survival. Madrid reshaped itself under a new Bourbon etiquette, fans snapping like small thunder in salons as Philip V's ministers tightened threads that had frayed under the last Habsburg, and far from the capital provinces bargained with the crown for the right to remain themselves. Barcelona, turning its balconies into banners and its courtyards into oaths. Civilians measured campaigns in prices and absences, wheat that climbed like a bad dream. Daughters married without dowries because the dowries had marched away in knapsacks, sons who returned speaking a foreign general's name in their sleep. The war was an animal that ate noise and left behind a silence full of chair-shaped holes at supper. Diplomats hauled the conflict into chairs and inked its edges into treaties, the words Utrecht and Rastatt stepping into history like doorways that close even as they let people through. Spain shed far-flung skins to keep its heart beating. Britain pocketed harbors like keys. Austria gathered bright fragments of Italy and the Low Countries, and France swallowed its pride to keep its bones. In 1714, Barcelona's bells rang themselves hoarse, and then fell quiet beneath artillery that argued in a language no city can answer forever. And when the smoke thinned, new decrees walked the streets with the measured tread of clerks, charters, unstitched councils, rewoven local laws, folded into a national fabric that scratched at first and then simply became skin. Pamphleteers turned Charles's autopsy into a parable portable as a pocket mirror, physicians wielding it like proof that superstition had worn a lab coat all along, preachers holding it up as a divine footnote, underlining the wages of pride. And somewhere between them the truth paced like a tired sentinel that a body can be both evidence and person, both lesson and life. In the Escorial's hush, the monk who wrote the epitaph closed his book and blew the candle out, but he carried the sentence in his head. He tried to be a king with a body that had been asked to be a dynasty. And if you listened, you could hear its cadence in the way the court spoke of duty afterward. Gentler, perhaps, as if a bruise remained that etiquette could not powder. The dynasty that had braided itself too tightly loosened in places and learned to breathe, and Europe adjusted its balance with the wary grace of a man recovering from a fever. Yet in portraits and in policies, the lesson persisted: power that loves its own reflection more than its people will one day mistake the mirror for a map and march straight into it. And if you think this story has finally closed its doors, Remember that palaces keep their best secrets in rooms mislabeled as storage, because behind one such door, amid rolled tapestries and dusty reliquaries, waits a ledger whose ink outlives kings. And when we open it next, the numbers will tell you how much a myth costs when it is paid for in breath and bread. Say, okay to go on. The ledger we promised opens with a scratch of the steward's quill columns for ships that never returned. Dowries paid to buy a truce from tomorrow. Arsenals stocked against phantoms on the map. Vials of medicine for a king whose body kept asking for receipts his bloodline could not produce. And at the bottom, a sum that balances only when you count in candles, not coins. Somewhere, a genealogist threads ribbons across a wall of portraits until the crossings tighten into a knot, and when he steps back he sees not a family tree, but a tourniquet. Call it policy if you like theology, if you must, but the body will name it something simpler: pressure without breath. An archivist breaks the brittle wax of an exorcist's seal and spreads the pages like wings, the vigils, the files, the litanies, the invisible knots drawn from air, then lays beside them the physician's ledgers of Bark and Bezoar and Mercury, and realizes both were theaters playing to different gods with the same desperate audience. Ask the city what it remembers, and it will not quote parchments. It will tell you of a winter when bread went black with price of soldiers who hummed foreign marches while waiting for pay of a midwife who wrapped a still room in silence and said nothing, because some griefs are born royal and die common. After the guns quieted, a mason set a date into new stone and brushed the dust from the numerals with a tenderness he did not waste on kings and children, learned to chant the name of a new Philip, the way they once chanted catechisms. But in the hush between lessons, a bruise the size of a century throbbing under the alphabet would not fade. Decrees stitched the kingdom tighter, measures standardized charters, trimmed a fabric woven for strength rather than lace. Yet in every plaza, a bell kept the older rhythm, as if to say reforms can reshape a body, but they cannot retroactively teach it how to be born. Centuries later, you stand in a museum where a portrait watches from behind glass, and a placard trades the word bewitched for consanguinity. And for a heartbeat, the room holds both stories at once. Demon and diagram, rumor and ratio, until you understand that myths are how fear remembers, and science is how fear explains. The autopsy page lies under light that hums. Phrases like water in the chest, blackened heart organs ill-formed, read today as clinical and yesterday as cosmic. And because people prefer morals to margins, the report was lifted to pulpits and pamphlets alike, serving as mirror for any sermon that needed one. Here is the part we were always walking toward: the lesson that purity pursued, past prudence becomes rot, that institutions mute themselves when loyalty mistakes silence for love, that a dynasty can die of worshiping itself. And if that sounds safely historical, ask of what your own time loves too much to question. Close the ledger, dim the lamp, let the Escorial swallow our footsteps, and as the door sighs shut, remember that this was never merely the tragedy of a man, but the autopsy of an idea, power folding in upon itself until a crown became a mirror. And if the glass still glitters in your mind, it is only because some reflections refuse to stop looking back.